Give them a warm welcome.
Seriously, go to the PyLadies auction. The stuff being auctioned off is epic. There's some really amazing stuff. There's this massive artwork from Wreck-It Ralph, like a big canvas-style poster. It's beautiful. You really should go. Or rather, don't go. I want that. So if you read the Django 1.5 release notes, you'll have seen that Django 1.5 ships with Python 3 support. And this is a big deal. It's been roughly 4 to 5 years since Python 3 first came out, and it's taken Django quite a while to transition to the point where, it's possible to use Python 3. And now that 1.5 is out, I thought it would be a good idea to give a talk and try to look at whether it's usable, and if so, how. Spoiler alert, it is. So, okay, you've probably got a few questions here. If you're in this room, presumably you're interested in Python 3 and Django, and you probably have some questions, and I'm going to try to sort of answer those questions, I think. So the first question you probably have is whether you want to use Python 3. I imagine some of you here are just here out of curiosity. What's this Python 3 thing? Oh, I hear I can use it with Django. Should I use it? Well, yeah, you should use it. It's actually pretty fantastic. I have been writing my first kind of real production site in Python 3 over the last 3-4 months, and I've been really surprised. I knew that Python 3 was sort of a better Python, and I had followed the development, and I had seen, oh yeah, they removed this thing that annoyed me. Oh, this has changed now. Oh, that syntax is better. But I didn't really think, it seemed small. Most of the changes didn't seem like that big a deal, and it didn't seem like it would actually improve my life. But the fact is that, all of these little warts that are in Python add up. And all of those things that you complain about, all of those things that you wish Python didn't do, they're gone now. Have you ever been confused about the difference between URL-lib and URL-lib2? Have you ever tried to find the URL parsing function only to find out it's neither in URL-lib nor URL-lib2, it's actually in URL parse? Have you ever tried to make an HTTP request, you do it with URL-lib, and then you realize, oh wait, I need more control, now I need HTTP-lib. There's all of these kind of weirdnesses and confusion gone in Python 3. The standard library has been cleaned up and reorganized. It's much easier to find what you're looking for. Have you ever been annoyed by that funky print syntax? Print, double arrow, file, confusing. Have you ever tried to figure out how you print to a file and remove that space that print adds? You know how print adds a space after things? Have you ever been annoyed by that? Well, in Python 3, print is now a function, and it just takes an end argument that you can set to none. Have you ever been annoyed that you've grabbed a library that uses print everywhere, all through the library, and there's no way to change that to go to a log instead of print? Well, now print's a function, so you can just say print equals log, and now it's rebound, and now it goes to a log. Have you ever had trouble remembering the super syntax? I see that you have. So in Python 3, the syntax is super, open, close, paren, dot, whatever. It just works. So none of this stuff is revolutionary or shocking or amazing, but it adds up to a day-to-day experience that's markedly better. I've scientifically determined that it's in fact 30% better. And if you'd like to see my numbers, you can't. But the really big thing for a web developer, and if you're using Django, I presume you're doing that, the really big thing is the change in Unicode handling. And I'll talk more about the nitty-gritty details, but it is an absolute game changer for web development. Under Python 2, you can write code that appears correct, and that works as long as your name is, say, JacobKaplan-Moss. And you put it in production, and all your tests pass, and everything's fine. And then one day, let's say Martin Van Lewis decides to sign up for your site. And now you get an exception. 6 months later. Well, what's probably happened is you're being sloppy about the difference between bytes and Unicode. And Python 2 makes this very easy to do. It does this thing where it just quietly says, oh, this is a Unicode string, but I need bytes. It looks kind of like bytes, so we'll pretend it's bytes. And this kind of runs counter to one of the tenets of Python. It's right there in the Zen of Python. In the face of ambiguity, refuse the temptation to guess. Well, when it comes to strings, one of the most basic types, Python 2 guesses. And the result of that is errors in production, days, weeks, months, years after you've actually written the code that are very hard to find and track down. On the other hand, Python 3 fails right away. If your tests pass, you don't have Unicode errors in production. And this doesn't seem like that big a deal, but in practice, it really, really is. There's a much, much higher level of assurance that your code will work not just on your laptop, not just on the American-centric version of the web, but on the real web that has, real people with names that don't fit into 8 bits. So the difference has really been markedly better. It's been cleaner, it's been faster to develop, there's been less hair tearing out. It's just been a much better experience. So I think you should develop on Python 3 if you can. And so that leads to the next question. Can you use Python 3? Unfortunately, the answer here is kind of a solid maybe. Like I said, it works, and much of what you need to build a popular site is done. And if you're building a new site from scratch, you don't have any legacy code that has to be ported, so you're probably okay. But it's not quite there yet. So one of the first things that you'll have to figure out if you're deciding whether Python 3 is right for you yet is you'll have to look at your dependencies, you'll have to look at your requirements, and you'll have to figure out what's done, what's not done, what can you live without, what's an absolute game, what's a deal breaker. And so some of the things, give you an example of like how this process works. So SQLite and PostgreSQL work fine under Python 3. The bindings have been ported, they work perfectly, they work. You just pip install psychopg, and now you're up and running on Postgres. If you use MySQL, there's about 2 or 3 forks of the MySQL Python bindings. None of them are particularly well tested, and particularly not against Django. So MySQL probably doesn't work. I don't actually know the state of Oracle, so I didn't put it on the slide. I didn't want to be wrong. And if you're using another sort of less supported database, less supported in Django, you're probably going to be even less lucky. So do you use Postgres? You're probably good to go on Python 3. Do you use MySQL? You might need to wait a little longer until these forks get resolved. Deployment's a reasonably good story. mod.wsgi was ported quite a long time ago. It's solid, it's fast, it's the same mod.wsgi that we've been using in the Python world for quite a long time. It's the safe choice, it's fast, it's scalable, it runs under Apache, it's good, it's really solid, it works really well, and it works just fine on Python 3. UWSGI has also been ported to Python 3. I haven't sort of kicked the tires as hard, but it appears to work pretty well. Gunicorn, which is one of the more popular pure Python servers, unfortunately the story is a little more mixed. Gunicorn itself has been ported to Python 3, but none of the async workers work very well under Python 3. The G-event hasn't been ported, eventlet hasn't been ported, and the tornado worker is unstable. So you're left with a situation where Gunicorn kind of works, but you probably wouldn't want to put it in production. There are some other servers that also work on Python 3. Cherry Pie has been ported, I know. And if you have something else that you like, you may need to check. This was the main limitation for a couple of years in getting Django stuff running on Python 3. The WSGI standard hadn't yet been updated, and so it wasn't really possible to make these servers work on Python 3. That got fixed last summer, and now sort of the floodgates have opened. I kind of expect most of this porting stuff to happen over the next year. So the short version of the story is that if you can write your site, you can deploy it. So that's really good news. Now, if you're using Django, you're probably also using a bunch of other plugins to Django. I grabbed this list from Django packages. It's the top 10 packages by number of downloads. And as you can see, the story for Django plugins is not particularly great. South, as of maybe just a month or so ago, finally has Python 3 support, but it's in trunk. There's no official release yet. You have to install the development release. Celery has worked for quite a while, but a lot of other stuff doesn't work. There's no debug toolbar, there's no Django registration, there's no Haystack, there's no TastyPie, there's no Sentry, or rather Raven collector. Django compressor is actually the most popular asset pipeline, I think, for Django, and it hasn't been ported yet. However, Django pipeline has, so there is an asset pipeline, which for me is a hard requirement. When I was evaluating whether I wanted to use Python 3, I knew that our front-end development was going to be in Sass and Compass, and I knew that I needed an asset pipeline. And so Django compressor was nearly a deal breaker, but discovering that pipeline exists and is more or less feature compatible was a good news. So when you evaluate your site and you think about whether you should use Python 3 or not, you're going to have to play a similar game. I left off a bunch of packages from here that I did use, but I went through this process with most things. Okay, I'd like to do some tagging features. Is Django Tagit ported yet? Oh, it's not. Well, now you kind of have two choices. You look and you say, okay, can I port this? Can I do the work myself? And that's what I'm going to talk about in the later part of this talk. Can I do the work myself and submit a pull request? Or is it going to be easier to just build it from scratch? And if that requirement is really big, if you're building a massive CMS-driven site and you want to use Django CMS, it's probably not in scope for that project for you to first port Django CMS to Python 3 in order to deliver on whatever you need. So the size of your dependency probably dictates in some sense whether you throw out the idea. So can you use Python 3? The answer is maybe. It's going to depend on what you're doing. It's going to be easier for new projects than for existing ones. And in fact, that's a recommendation that I would make. If you're starting a new site, seriously evaluate Python 3. You might save yourself a lot of hair pulling. If you have an existing site, you probably want to stay with Python 2 for now until more of these X's turn to check marks. So, if you want to use Python 3, what does that actually mean? You have basically three options. You can just write Python 3. Just write only Python 3 code. This is what you do if you have a new site, right? If you're developing something new from the ground up, there's no need to support Python 2. You get to choose what interpreter you're using. But a lot of the times you're dealing with existing code. Maybe you've got an app, a Django app that you've released that you want to release and support both Python 2 and Python 3. And that's the case with a lot of these dependencies, right? If you want to use South, well, South isn't going to stop supporting Python 2, but it also can't never support Python 3. So you need a way to support both Python 2 and Python 3. And for that, you have two options. There's a tool called 2 to 3, and there's a technique called single or shared source. So 2 to 3. 2 to 3 was the first tool that was released for maintaining shared Python 2 and Python 3 code. It was the original idea. It was what was pictured by the Python core team when they were trying to grapple with this question of how do you release code that runs on both Python 2 and Python 3. There's going to be this time where we have feet in both camps. How do we support both? And then what 2 to 3 does, it's a source-to-source translator. It looks at your Python 2 code, and it outputs a patch that you apply to your Python 2 code to get Python 3 code. It's actually kind of amazing technology. It's incredibly cool the way that it does this, the way that it's able to make inferences about your Python 2 code and kind of magically turn it into Python 3. Unfortunately, it turns out to not be that practical. And the reason for that is, let's say you've got an app, you're writing it against Python 2, you run 2 to 3, and you release a Python 3 version. And now a user reports a bug against the Python 3 version and gives you a patch. You can't apply that patch. You have to make them give you a Python 2 patch, apply it to the Python 2 code, run 2 to 3, and then produce the Python 3 version. It effectively turns Python 3 into like a compiled version of Python 2, and it means that the source code, that your Python code is not your Python code. So unfortunately, 2 to 3, I don't recommend using it for dual source. It might be useful as a one-time shot. You want to take an existing code base and switch to Python 3 and never look back. 2 to 3 might be useful. But for something where you're going to be continually develop both 2 and 3, not a good idea. So single source is the winner. And what it turns out, as we've learned over the last few years of writing Python 3 code, is that it's possible to write Python 3 code that kind of happens to work on Python 2. And that's effectively what this technique is. You write code that runs on Python 3, and through a combination of careful use of syntax and some clever tricks, it runs on Python 2. And this is great because what it means is you're writing Python 3, which is where we want to be, right? But it also runs on Python 2. You can continue to support the bulk of the users of your library. So here's the general approach. I'll give you the overview of how you approach a shared source or a porting, and then I'll walk you through 2 examples. So first you have to choose an approach. Are you going Python 3 only, or are you going shared source? And again, the distinction here is usually, am I producing a project, am I producing a site, or am I producing an app? If I'm producing something that I just need to deploy, I go Python 3 only. If I'm producing something that I want to use as the foundation of other code, I probably want to do shared source. Evaluate your dependencies. Is this even possible? Next, you need to get the test suite running. It's interesting, my experience porting apps to Python 3 has been, it's harder to get the test suite running than it is to get the test suite fixed. Just the sort of basics of getting all the syntax to the point where the test suite will actually run is often sufficient to fully port the app. Unspoken in this slide is the sort of assumption that you have a test suite. That laugh tells me that you are not practicing your test-driven development as much as you ought to. Unfortunately, sort of testing is a step 0. If you're trying to port an app that doesn't have at least a somewhat reliable test suite, your first step is to create that test suite. There was an app that I wanted to use, and I was prepared to put the effort forth to port it, and I discovered that its test suite has been failing for about the last 18 months, and no one's really been fixing it. And that was the point at which I kind of threw up my hands and said, I don't want to have to first fix the test suite and then port the app. So unfortunately, a sort of hard requirement is having at least reasonable test coverage. Once your test suite is running, probably the first thing you'll have to do is deal with unicode handling, and I'll talk about this in detail. And finally, just iterate on your test failures and pick things off one at a time. Most fixes are single-line fixes, and you can just kind of iterate over and over and over again. So 2 case studies to close us out. The first, creating a project. The second, porting an app. So I wanted to create a new website. So Python 3 only, it's clearly what I want to do. I do not need to deploy a website under 2 versions of Python. That is madness. So what are my requirements here? I had some CMS requirements. Can't use Django CMS, but they weren't big enough that I needed that. I need some user authentication stuff that's reasonably complex, but I was going to write that from scratch anyway, so I might as well do that. I need some integration with social networks. This is a pretty big one. I really want to use Django Social Auth, but it's not ported yet. So I decided that in this particular case, it's worth it for me to spend the extra time to actually port that app. So by the time, hopefully, the plan is we've planned into the project the effort that it's going to take to port Django Social Auth, and hopefully we'll get it running on Python 3. And I need to handle pretty good traffic, so I did some quick benchmarks on mod.wsgi to discover that it, in fact, performs just fine. So I'm good there. I'm just running a project. It's easy to get my tests running. I don't need to do anything special, but I did want to plug Django Discover Runner because it's awesome. Unicode handling is pretty much the same in Python 3 under Django as it is in Python 2. You're familiar with Django utils encoding for dealing with converting text to bytes and back. Django utils encoding just works correctly on both Python 2 or Python 3, and you don't really have to know at this level what's going on underneath. And it works. I was able to develop a site. It runs, it works, it looks great. But my estimate is it probably costs about 20% more. It's in time, right? So it's not the same as doing a site in Python 2. It has a slightly larger cost. In this particular case, the project was such that this is absorbable. It's not a problem. But in your particular case, something on the order of 20% more time or 20% more money may not be. So that's another factor you may want to take into consideration. That 20% of extra time represents essentially either rewriting stuff that is not available, an app that I might want to use but isn't, tagging, or porting stuff that I want to use and is easy to port. So, second case study, porting Django site tree. As is my general MO, I'm going to take credit for someone else's work at this point. Jeff Triplett, who's probably watching the KU game and not actually here right now, did the work porting Django site tree. So Django site tree is a navigation tool. We really like it. We thought it would be perfect for this site. It only ran under Python 2. I have a link here to the actual patch if you want to read what the changes are. It's actually reasonably short. The work took about a day. It wasn't substantial. So we wanted to use shared source. Django site tree already has existing users, so we can't ace them out. We needed to support Python 2.6 and above, and Python 3.3, and we wanted to support Django 1.4 and Django 1.5. A brief word on Python 3 support. I want to encourage you just to target Python 3.3. Python 3 is not in wide enough production yet that it's really worth you going back and supporting Python 3.2, and there are enough new changes in Python 3.3 that make it worth it to sort of make that your main targeted version of Python 3. So if you are going to target Python 3, I would target 3.3. If you need to support Python 2.5, it gets really hard. So realistically, the sort of easy to support is 2.6 and above and 3.3 and above. If you have to go outside of those parameters, you're signing up for a ton more work. So Django site tree, one of the reasons it's a candidate for easy porting is it has no dependencies. The entire Django ecosystem is kind of going to have to be ported this way. We're going to have to find all the stuff that has no dependencies and port that, and then we're going to have to port the next stuff, and then the next stuff, and then the next stuff. So if your thing has 9 dependencies and none of them have been ported yet, you don't want to sort of sign up for porting a whole tree of stuff. So Django site tree was a good choice there. For running the test suite, we really like a tool called Tox. Tox lets you run your tests against multiple versions of dependencies. So here's a sort of snippet from our Tox file for this project. And you can see I set up these environments, Python 2.7, Django 1.4, Python 3.3, Django 1.5, and I can tell Tox what my version of Python is, what my different dependencies are, and Tox will automate running my tests against all my different environments. It's really nice. It lets you have, actually run tests against a bunch of different combinations of your environments. And it means that I can locally run my tests and establish that everything works as I would like it to. So the next step is you're going to have to make some syntax changes. Print became a function. The exception syntax changed. Meta classes look different. Pay attention to that last meta class thing, because that's kind of interesting. With the exception of the classes, the Python 3 versions also work on Python 2. The as syntax is there, raising exceptions, it works that way. In Python 2, if you put parentheses around the print statement, it still works. It just, and in fact, there's a future function from future import print statement, I think it is. So for the most part, you can do this stuff on Python 2, but the last one you can't. So that's kind of interesting if you're trying to do one code base. We'll come back to that. Unicode handling, Django utils encoding. Really cool. Django utils encoding smart bytes, convert something to bytes, and it knows the correct type to use whether you're on Python 2 or Python 3. This is a huge lifesaver, and I really appreciate having it there when I'm working on Python 2 and 3. It kind of just does the right thing. One thing that doesn't magically work, remember on Python 2, you use the unicode function to provide a string representation of your model. Well, unfortunately, under Python 3, unicode doesn't exist anymore. It's called string. So you need either a unicode or an str. So Django has this kind of awkward Python 2 unicode compat class decorator, which will solve this problem for you. It's a little awkward, but it does the right thing. So now you've got tests, and now they're failing, and now you need to fix stuff. And all the stuff you're going to have to fix is stuff that either doesn't work on Python 2 or doesn't work on Python 3. And that's where this library called 6 comes in. So 6 provides the missing glue, all the stuff that is different between Python 2 and Python 3. So I showed you that meta-class example. Well, we have incompatible code on Python 2 or Python 3, but 6 has a function called 6.withMetaClass, which kind of does the right thing on Python 2 or Python 3. So now we can resolve a different syntax into one piece of code that works on both sides. And 6 has things like binary types and text types, which resolve to either string or bytes, or Unicode or string. This weird thing happened between Python 2 and Python 3. str became bytes, and Unicode became str, and everyone's head exploded. And 6 papers over that and makes it work on both versions. And finally, 6 has the sort of fallback 6.py3. Right? If you really have to know whether you're on Python 2 or Python 3, you can just use an if statement. I would caution you to try to avoid that. 6 has a lot more than I put on these slides, and for almost every situation, 6 will kind of give you something to do the right thing for incompatibilities between 2 and 3. This if 6.py3 is kind of an escape hatch. Be careful with it. It forks your code. It makes your tests run differently on different environments. It's probably a bad idea, but sometimes it's the only one available. So I've kind of only scratched the surface here, but I want to point you to the Django documentation. Django.me/py3 will redirect you there, and it'll tell you a lot more about what I just did, about how to port your stuff to either Python 2, to a dual source between Python 2 and Python 3. And I really want to encourage you to work on porting your apps. So a couple years ago at PyCon, Guido described the process of moving to Python 3 as a process where everyone points at the guy who's holding it up. Everyone stands there and points until that person ports their code, and then they shift and point at someone else. And about 18 months ago, everyone started pointing at Django. Databases worked, deployment worked. Now in order to port your sites, we needed to do what we needed to do. So we're done. We're done being pointed at. We did what we needed to do. And now I'm up here pointing at all of you. I suspect there are many of you out here who have Django apps that are relied on, that work on Python 2, and now I'm pointing at you. It's your turn. If you port your apps, if you port Django Tagged, if you help port Haystack, if you help port TastyPie, more and more sites can move to Python 3. So this is your opportunity. This is your turn. I won't be taking questions here because I suspect there are going to be too many of them. So what I've done is I've booked an open space room upstairs, room 201. If you have questions about moving your stuff to Python 3, and if you want help, come find me up there or find me at the sprints. I'm going to be sprinting on moving stuff to Python 3. Thank you very much, and go port your stuff.